Stick to,
I've got a copy on my shelf up there. I haven't actually read it cover to cover yet.
It's okay, no one has.
It's on my list too.
Hello and welcome to this brand new season of the Portholes podcast on the Bearing Straight channel. Ryan, of course, back. Great to see you again.
Good to be here in my own office.
I was going to say, our environment has changed. We are, the next 6 or so episodes will be from your office here aboard Battleship New Jersey. We thought this was a more interesting location than the boring recording studio at my office in Annapolis. With that being said, you will hear some interesting ship sounds throughout all these episodes. So just keep that in mind, and there's just very little you can do about it. But I think it adds to the experience, you know, since this is a museum ship and you all are watching because you seem to like that sort of stuff. So why not?
It certainly reminds you that we're in an office, or that we're on a ship and not just in an office somewhere.
Right, yeah. Exactly. Today, so kicking off, before we kick off, if you haven't already and you've watched this before, go ahead and slap that subscribe button. Pretend it's a broadsiding cruiser, and your finger, 16-inch armor-piercing salvo from New Jersey, and just slap it. Right? Do it. Slap it. Smack it. And if you would. But anyway, today we are going to be talking about New Jersey and her trip to dry dock here very shortly.
And I've got some information to talk about that we probably won't cover on our own channel.
Oh yeah, this is some really good stuff. So if you're interested in hearing some sort of behind the scenes stuff and getting an insight into what it's going to take to get New Jersey to dry dock, stay tuned. We got a lot coming up. So, Ryan, you were telling me about some really interesting details about New Jersey's dry docking that maybe some people hadn't heard about, but we'll get into that in just a second. But tell me, what's going on with Big J here? Which is where we are, by the way.
We are in my office on Battleship New Jersey right now.
Mm-hmm.
So if like that ship smell is permeating through the camera and you start to get like that diesel fume headache, that's why.
If you don't have smell-o-vision, yeah, it's pretty wonderful. You know, it's a very unique smell that you only get on museum ships. I don't think I've ever encountered this smell in other places.
Honestly, I haven't encountered the smell in like 8 or 10 years. I'm so nose blind to it now.
That's true. Yeah. Okay. Well, you're probably used to it, but someone like me, it always hits you pretty hard when you first come aboard, no matter how many times you've been on museum ships and things like that. So New Jersey, we're about maybe a month or two out from dry dock, which is a big deal.
Yeah. No, there's years and years of planning to get to this point, and still months of really concentrated work to finish it off.
I think it's pretty incredible because, you know, you and I will be messaging and you'll be like, oh man, I haven't had a day off in forever, and we've been putting in these ridiculous hours and everything, and theoretically winter is supposed to be your slow time, so I guess that's why you do it.
And we intentionally scheduled things to be happening now because it was the slow time, and we have the time to do it with the reduced staff we have.
So with that being, what is going on? So you still have the decking project going on right now. So what's the deal with that? Because they're still trying to deck, and then what? You're gonna pull up the lines and get towed upriver here soon. So so before we dive into the dry docking, what's the deal with the deck?
No, the ideal certainly would be to do one capital project and then ride the momentum from that into the next capital project into the next. But both the deck and dry docking, we have been trying to do for years. You're supposed to redeck one of these ships in the Navy about once every 20 years. You're supposed to dry dock an inactive ship about once every 20 years. And so we were pretty close to that point by the time we inherited the ship. And dry docking is a $10 million project. Redecking is a $5 million project.
Mm-hmm.
And we are about a $5 million a year operation. Your ticket sales donations only equals $5 million. And that covers our regular operating expenses.
Mm-hmm.
That's not all the extra stuff on the side for a capital project.
For that kind of work, right.
So we've been very fortunate that for the last, I'd say, 4 or 5 years, the state has been supporting us to the tune of about $750,000, $500,000 to $750,000 in matching grants to do the deck project. And we're still about a year from finishing that. But throughout this whole time, we've been talking about, hey, our next project is going to be this. And so in this last year, they said, all right, here's $5 million. Here's half of what you need to dry dock the ship. So that dictates, well, we got to go now. We can't hope that money's still in the bank in a couple of years when it's convenient for us.
Yeah.
Because not only may the money not be there, the ship is still aging.
Sure.
We have had issues that mean that the ship needs to be dry docked now, and she's over 10 years overdue as it is. So pushing it back another year isn't an option, really.
So what's the, and again, I don't know these things, that's why I'm asking. But for an Iowa-class battleship like New Jersey, because, remind me, Missouri has already gone?
She's the only one of these ships to be dry docked by her museum.
Okay.
She went into, I think it's dry dock 4 at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard, which is an active Navy base, in 2009.
Okay, so she's technically the first Iowa-class battleship to go to dry dock as a museum. Do you count that? Because, I mean, if she's already in Pearl Harbor and she stays in Pearl Harbor and goes into dry dock, and that was a Navy, since that's a Navy yard, Navy owned, I guess, not private. What's the differences? Do you think she had an easier time in that process, or do you think it was even more difficult given the fact that they did have to work with the Navy? Or do you think the Navy was more cooperative because Missouri is already there in Pearl Harbor, and that's that brings in a lot of tourists and it helps tell the story of World War II?
That's definitely a little column A, a little column B. Being in Pearl Harbor, they get more tourists. They have the funding to do this.
Sure.
But that's one of the main reasons why they were able to go on time, and we've not been able to.
Well, 2009. So you said on time, 2009. It's 2024, which is amazing to me. So you're about 15 years late. But the ship's not in terrible condition. It's not like you expect to find. It's not like you have big rust holes and other things. You're not suffering from like rotting torpedo protection like Texas and.
No, definitely. That we are, by virtue of just being a newer ship and far more recently operated than Texas, we're in better condition. Yeah.
The ships were obviously reactivated in the 80s, and they would have gone through all this process during the Reagan administration.
Yeah,
and then so then they were in good shape when they were handed over.
And our tagline is not like Texas. We need to dry dock the ship now, or the ship will not be here in a few years. Our tagline is, we need to dry dock the ship now for $10 million, or in a few years, we'll be dry docking her like Texas for $65 million.
Okay.
So the ship can certainly survive and function as a museum ship for a little while longer. But as we get closer to our 100-year mark, that's when you start to see the things that you see on ships like Texas and Olympia that are the marker, the cornerstone for us. Most of the museum ships in this country are World War II era, as you know. So that we're all in our mid-80s.
That is pretty amazing, though, when you just said that, as we get close to our 100-year mark. And that's something that studiers of this period, it's sort of hard to think about that. Because obviously, you think, okay, well, I was born in the 90s, and the ship was 50 years old. Okay, well, now I'm 30. Crap. So yeah. So,
I got the hairline to prove it.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate it. So now the ships are now they're in their 80s, but before too much longer, they'll be 100 years old. And it's just crazy to think that, this structure that we're sitting in, that's still seemingly so has this modern feel.
Yeah, yeah.
But still could be 100 years old, because Texas, and last time we saw each other, we were over there at Olympia.
Yes.
That feels old. Like that, like when you look at that between the wood and just the iron and the steel and the riveting, that feels like an old ship.
Mm-hmm.
And it is for sure. But you look at New Jersey and you're like, this doesn't feel like you think.
Yeah, it's
like,
weird that the walls are steel in here, but otherwise it feels like a normal office, right?
Well, no, I just meant like, but you look at the steel and you think, oh, this could have been turned out of the yard last week,
Yeah.
you know, and there's not really a whole lot of, yes, obviously there are some differences, but the base sort of structure could be something that Norfolk turns out this year. You know, if you really like went around and you looked at a new Ford class or something, there's not a whole lot of difference here.
If we told people that we were filming in one of the offices on Gerald Ford, they wouldn't know the difference, I don't think.
So that is really amazing to think that the ship is 80 years old. It's closer to 100, and that's pretty remarkable. So,
and the important thing to keep in mind is our 20-year-old crew members during World War II are at a 100-year mark. They won't be here when the ship gets to 100.
Fair.
Like this ship and other machines like her will, in our lifetime, be the only veterans of World War II that are left, the only living reminders of that conflict. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important that we do this now. We have the ship looking her best so that she's preserved to that point and beyond that point, so that my kids who will have never met a World War II veteran can still experience something like this.
No, that's very true. And I'm glad, ultimately, I think everyone is pretty glad that you and the staff here are taking such good care of her, and we'll see this project through.
It's a major concern of mine that somebody's going to come up at some point and be like, hey, why are you spending money on preserving an old thing like this instead of building a school in the city or something like that? Why is the state funding that? And we haven't heard any of that. And that does my heart good that people understand the significance of preserving an artifact like this.
Well, I think few states, too, have the privilege of having not only a battleship. I mean, hold on, I take that back. I think having a museum ship is one thing, but then having a battleship, which is a completely different, and something that is named for your state versus just like a city or or like a destroyer, which could be completely irrelevant to your location. But but then on top of that, you have New Jersey. It's an Iowa class battleship. It had this huge career. It is what it is. So I think in this particular instance, I think the state of New Jersey is probably right in doing what they are doing to help you all.
And we're super thankful for it, because I don't know how we would accomplish it without their support, but without that first half from them, without half of the money for the deck project.
Yeah.
The ship is just sitting here rotting.
Yeah. Now, I brought this up in a previous episode, and I can't remember exactly what the context was, but when we talk about Texas, because of the ships, and I asked this question before, and I'm not sure if it was relevant, but because the ships were manufactured in the 40s, and they were sort of state of the art for that time, which we would later find out was exceptionally state of the art, and then allowed them to carry through to the 80s and 90s, and then, as we just said, could potentially be even closely related to the ships that are still being turned out now. Because you have to think, like, Arleigh Burkes are being turned out in that same sort of time period.
It's incredible, a class of ships where we'll be decommissioning the first one at end of life and still building new models in that same design.
Right, and so that's kind of like my whole point here. It's so this ship and the Navy that it served in, and of course the Navy today is still maintaining a lot of the same sort of strategy and the way that these things are built. And so do you think that the fact that she was designed and built sort of for that World War II era means that she will last longer than perhaps a older dreadnought like Texas, which maybe the material quality is different, the idea that the Navy knows that we're going to order these ships in pairs, the standard class battleships, we know that this is an evolution, things are coming, so we don't expect Texas to last as long. Because do you really think when they ordered Texas, they think this thing will be in dry dock, being half rebuilt in 2024.
If any of her designers thought that, then had the best crystal ball I've ever heard of.
I mean, I'm glad that we have that ship around, but I really do think though that those older battleships were. I don't think anyone was thinking these will have a short-term service life. They'll do what they need to do. You know, we went through World War I and everything. They were refit, and then I'm always amazed that then they survived the interwar period and then continued to fight into World War II. And then it only makes sense then that they were pulled out after the end of World War II, because you have ships like this now. Why do you need Texas?
I dare say that ships like Texas and those pre-war ships were built in peacetime, gold-plated in every way possible at that time, whereas ships built in World War II, you're like mass producing them. They have to go out there, but they don't have to come back. Mm-hmm. So we're going to build 175 Fletcher-class destroyers and however many Liberty ships.
So we're gonna you just touched on a point that I'm gonna bring up again in another episode today. So we're gonna put a pause on that because that's a key idea in another episode. But as far as
it is worth pointing out though that even though they're built during World War II, the Iowa class battleships are not. It is worth pointing out that even though these are war-built ships, and there were material shortages and things going on along with that, they're still gold platers in that they are not designed to be mass producible.
Mm-hmm. Battleship. This is a very expensive piece. You're not turning this out like Fletchers and submarines, and
even the Essex class aircraft carriers had like things squared off to be mass producible, and we churned out a ton of them. That this class of ships didn't. They've got all these curves and really intricately machined parts.
Well, and we've seen that in other places. So obviously, you see that in some of the issues that the Fletchers are having, the museum Fletchers, with their hull plating just not being that thick in general. Mm-hmm. And then you add the fact that now they're 80 years old and they've worn away. So you just have to reskin those ships and how just these mass produced. And then like the Independence class carriers and how flimsy they were. And so as soon as the war ends, get rid of everything. So I guess, so you're saying, yes, that is correct. A battleship like this, just not only because it's a battleship, but because of the material investment, the time, the money, just everything.
Yeah.
It's just naturally going to live up to a higher standard.
Yeah, but then that said, not only are we watching Texas to see what our material condition will likely be in 20 years, we're also looking at the other World War II ships like the Fletcher class, and they're having hull issues. Well, our shell plating, our skin of the ship at the bow, is only 1/16 of an inch thicker than a Fletcher class destroyer. It's not 12 inches all the way around the ship.
Sure.
Like you think of. So when we see a ship that's commissioned in 1943, just like we are, so built at the exact same time out of the exact same material, spring a leak, that really was one of the things that we were able to take to the state and say, look, we have 1/16 of an inch more at the bow of our ship. We've seen battleships like North Carolina have to do a massive amount of work repairing their bow where they've sprung a leak, or where they thought they had thin enough plating that they needed to work on that. So we are this close to being there. We can pay $10 million now, or we can pay $65 million in 5 or 10 years.
Okay, so when you do go to dry dock, and when you're actually there, and the ship is blocked, and you're looking at it from underneath, how do you test for that material thickness? Now, obviously, since the ships were reactivated multiple times, they've had treatments, and the hulls have been painted and everything, and going back to the 80s now, which was still a long time ago now when you think about it.
Before either of us were born.
Right. So that material, I'm assuming, is in slightly better condition than maybe the Fletchers, which were deactivated much, much sooner. But it still doesn't change the fact that it's relatively similar. And to your point, if you didn't do something now and you waited another decade or so then that would really be a problem.
Exactly. The fact that we were in active service into the 90s, while most of these ships got out of active service in the 50s or 60s, and then are turned into museums in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
And have been operating the same way we are, where museums can raise enough money to do the day-to-day maintenance. But for capital projects, major improvements, things like that, it is much more difficult to get funding. So yeah, we are in better shape. We're looking at a couple things. Well, when we get her on the blocks and we can actually look at her hull, we're going to be able to tell, like, oh my God, there's this huge rust bloom where all the scale has just built up. We know that that's an issue, an area where we have to look at, where we've lost all this material.
Really?
The steel has turned back into iron oxide, which means that there's not steel anymore there.
So
when we drain all the water from the dry dock, if water continues to drip from the hull, we'll have a pretty good indicator that...
yeah. Okay. Well,
I have used that milestone before.
But not if... maybe this is a good time then to talk about your other problem. Which, but if water continues to drip from the hull, but you've pumped the hull full of water prior to dry dock, then how do you know? So this goes back to a problem that the Iowa-class battleships have, where you don't have... So you have the armored box. That's where the steering gear is, right? And that naturally sort of pulls the back end of the ship down.
Yeah, and that seems to have been improved significantly during the design process. So there seems to be a lot of extra weight added there that maybe wasn't there when they initially started doing the design and the stability and everything else.
So what's the exact problem that your ballasting issue?
All right. So these ships sit about 10 feet higher in the bow than at the stern. Just when they're normally loaded.
Is that because of the extra weight back there, or did I just make that up?
No. The extra weight of the steering gear is probably what's dragging our stern down. Okay. And the Navy would have compensated for this in service by loading the bow with all sorts of stores and the ammunition for 2 turrets up there versus 1 at the stern.
A bow which already doesn't have a lot of buoyancy.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, the stern is this big wide area with plenty of buoyancy to hold extra weight. The bow is pretty narrow.
Gotcha.
And then, of course, all the fuel, feed water, stuff like that all goes at the bow of the ship. So that would have brought us down.
You know, people are going to love this. It's just, this is bad for editing, but this is the kind of stuff that you all tune in for, right?
There was any question about whether we were on a ship or not.
I know. This is fantastic.
No, but the all that stuff would have brought the bow down to within a couple of feet of trim, which is how the ships are designed to operate. The problem is, if we go into the yard with more than 4.81 feet of trim, or difference between the bow and the stern of the ship, when we sit her down on the blocks, she'll sit down on the rudders, propellers, the docking keels and skegs and that sort of stuff first. So all the weight of the ship is coming down on those very thin parts, and they'll crush.
So first, okay. So obviously, as it settles, it hits first, and then the rest of the ship will then settle on the blocks.
Eventually. Whereas what we want to do is have the whole ship touch down at one time, so that all that weight that we're probably over 45,000 tons empty like we are right now is going to hit simultaneously, so that it's distributed evenly.
So I have a question. When I don't know if there's if you've ever worked on your own car or anything, but when you jack up a car, you have the manufacturer assigns jacking points. So areas of the underside that can take the load of the vehicle, with a jack either pushing up because if you look up jacking fail on YouTube, you'll get people putting jacks through their floor of their car, through their oil pans, stupid stuff.
Oh my God. Oh my God.
So you have to put the weight of the vehicle on a certain spot. Shops do this when they put cars up on hoists. So is there a similar thing for the keel blocks?
Absolutely.
So in your owner's manual, you open up your New Jersey owner's manual and you say, okay, keel block, 1 through 1,000 go on here, here, and here. So could you just shed a little insight on how the blocking is actually done?
Yeah, so the blocking plans for these ships, and they take into account two important things. The number of through hull openings, so the holes in the bottom of the ship for cooling water to get into the engines, and drinking water to get into the evaporators, and then all these sorts of openings in the ship. We've got about 165 of them. Those cannot take the weight, so the blocks have to be around that.
Okay.
2 is, this is a riveted hulled ship, so the plates overlap. And they tend to overlap so that you've got one on the bottom and then one up above, and then one on the bottom, one up above.
So it alternates.
Exactly.
As it goes down. Okay.
So you do not put the blocks on the one that's above. That's always
inside.
the lower
Right.
one. Exactly.
Yeah,
it's always the outside
because
one.
I guess in theory, if you put it up on the inside, you're pushing, then you can separate the plate.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So those seem to be the two big things.
And then what about framing? Then did you take the frames into account?
To a certain extent. The regular side-to-side frames, the ribs of the ship, it doesn't seem like the blocks are specifically designed to line up on those in any special way.
Really?
In fact...
Like not directly underneath of a frame? Because you'd think then that's how the load would be distributed downwards, and then the block would be holding it.
Yeah, I won't say for certain that they don't do that, but it seems like there's more blocks than frames.
Okay.
So they're not super concerned about the block must be on the frame. But for longitudinals that run the length of the ship, that seems to be where they've framed up to take the blocks. So when you look at the blocks, they are almost in they're in 5 rows. So there are more or less 5 lengthwise structures that help distribute that weight.
Gotcha.
That's also the 5 places where the plates are overlapped just right. And that also takes into account things like the docking keels back here, the skegs.
Just under the skegs, yeah.
Which this entire weight of the steering gear, armor, and all of this is sitting directly on just those 2 very thin points.
So another question that I have had. So in your New Jersey owner's manual, under the section of towing, so before you've even gotten to the dry dock and having to block and everything, actually towing the ship. So I saw recently in one of your videos you got capstans going again. As far as getting like features of the ship working to help out.
And even if I had a user's manual and 6 weeks to go through it all, we still don't have enough crew to fire it up.
And then you mentioned having a generator on board and providing electricity to the pumps to make all that stuff work, because obviously you can't just fire it up. This isn't a Hollywood production. So when the ship is towed, like actually being towed, obviously I'm assuming the Navy, you're following the Navy procedure for that.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And the Coast Guard regulations for dead ship tow as well.
Okay. And so how is that rigged up front? Obviously, you're not getting out towing eyelet number 1 and screwing it in, and But so is there any special way of rigging that up front, or?
Actually, I think for this tow we're going to be on the hip.
Oh, okay. They're gonna.
I believe there's going to be 4 tugboats involved. And 2 of them are basically just going to be there to bump the bow and the stern to help turn us. So rudders don't work anymore. But 2 of them are going to basically tie up on the outboard side of the ship.
Okay.
And they'll tie up to the bollards there.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll just ride their hip right on into the...
Oh, okay. All right. So you won't have to rig anything out front or...
No, we don't have to pull the towing cable and wrap it around the bar bed of the turret. And
wow. That's... Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to know. So let's go. My next point, we're going to talk about another museum ship really quickly. U-505.
Okay.
When U-505 was captured at sea by members of the United States Navy, the first time since 1812, the Germans managed to flood and but in their attempt to sort of scuttle the boat. So we acquired this half-sunk Type 9 U-boat, and everything was kind of dead at that point. The diesels were were flooded, and so you can't just fire it up and let it go. So they had the bright idea of engaging the electric motor, which is connected to the propellers. And as I believe USS Casablanca, it was, if I'm not mistaken, was the actual light carrier.
Was it Guadalcanal?
Or no, I think maybe you're right. It was Guadalcanal. Was it a Casablanca class carrier? Can't remember.
She is a Casablanca class aircraft carrier.
Someone will say it, but I think you're right. I think Guadalcanal.
And don't ask me which destroyer it was that went alongside.
Right. So as they were towing the submarine, the windmill effect on the propellers, so as she's being towed through the water.
Yes.
The water is hitting the propellers, spinning it, which is then going back through the shafts and hitting the electric motors, which are now generators in reverse. That charged the batteries enough to where then they activated the pumps, which then they could level the boat out, and then that's how eventually they righted it and they went from there. That's how. So as I joke, when how to tow a car? Okay, well, I'll put it in neutral. Okay, there's more to it than just that. So, are your propellers heavy enough, your shafts heavy enough, and all your machinery heavy enough and at the speeds you're going, I really doubt you'll see any kind of movement in that regard. Like, you're not worried about like that. So you don't have to take like a section out of the like shaft or do something, or I don't know how you deal with that.
Let me tell you a little bit about the historic side and then the
okay.
So these ships they would frequently operate with one shaft stopped and locked so they could do maintenance on the turbine. So they actually calculated these ships could do 26 knots on 3 shafts.
Which and any 3 shafts?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter like inboard, outboard.
Yeah, it doesn't really matter which of the 4 is down for maintenance at that time.
And is that just a lack of propulsive force and drag, or? Cause I'm assuming the propeller does provide a stationary propeller of that size does.
It creates a lot of drag. Exactly. So that drag would transmit, or if it wasn't locked, it would spin the propeller, which would spin the shaft, which would spin the engine that presumably you've got the cover off and you got somebody in there working.
Yeah.
So that's bad. So when they did this, they would intentionally lock the shaft to keep it from spinning and just accept that drag. And that drag is what is slowing us down, why we can't hit 33 knots instead of what we can hit at that.
Well, presumably you don't have, but
yeah, you don't have the full power. You've lost a quarter of your horsepower. Yeah.
So,
but when the ship was decommissioned, the Navy did some preservation stuff inside the engines, and they locked the shafts for that as well, so that while she's sitting there, the tide coming in and out doesn't spin the propellers and spin the engines. So that
is that jacking gear, or what's the park? Put it in park. What's the
in service? The jacking gear is what would lock it.
Okay.
The Navy just took these really big, they're about 6-inch diameter pipes and wedged them in some of the places to lock it in place.
Okay, big brain stuff. Similar to the turret locking.
Yeah.
We'll weld a bolt over top of this. Yeah, they'll never figure that out. Ryan comes through with a grinder. I've shown you, Navy.
There's a reason why they did it on us and they don't do it on all of the museum battleships.
Yeah. So, in this particular case, all the shafts are locked now. So
they won't even be pinwheeling.
So they won't. So nothing will be moving like that. Okay.
There will be an amount of drag that the tugboats have to overcome.
But you're going slow enough, like you're not going 26 knots when the tugboats are pushing you. So the amount of drag that's probably creating is probably not really as noticeable as if you were trying to still maintain some sort of speed.
We're only going 6 miles.
Yeah,
we're only probably, if I had to guess, I'm not the tugboat operator. They'll certainly have a say in this, but 5 knots, something like that. We're not going that fast on the river. We create a wake, and then that's going to disrupt other shipping and other maritime operations around us. So there's a speed limit here in the Delaware River.
And I guess with that being said, obviously the New Jersey still has her propellers.
Mhm.
And this is another thing that sometimes people don't think about. A lot of these, as you've seen, like Texas, the images, Texas doesn't have her propellers. And a few other museum ships don't. Obviously, Midway had theirs removed. And this is something that you and I had this conversation before. So the idea that the propellers being on the ship kind of makes the ship whole, like in your mind.
Yeah, you can't see them, but
you can't see them. And so you're like, well, it's like, it's like the red button thing. It's like, take them off and make the ship like incomplete, but then move one on land and have it be visible, or keep them on there and keep this idea that the artifact is somehow maintained.
Which also causes the ship to corrode more because the propellers are made out of a different material than the hull.
So with that being said, your plan is to keep the propellers on the ship. As of right now, like a part of this dry docking, they will not be removed.
That is the ideal outcome.
Now, hypothetically, if you get back there and like packing is messed up and you think, oh, okay, this might cause a leak in the next 20 years, maybe we take them off.
Exactly. We do not currently have the funding to remove them. We would like to keep the ship intact because once we remove them, anything could happen. Like we put them at a park somewhere and then 20 years from now, somebody forgets what the importance is and they just sell it for scrap. Get that lawn ornament out of here. But as long as they're on the ship.
Must be a very expensive piece of scrap, though. I mean, historical value aside, just the physical weight and material.
Yeah, it's something like 20 tons of pre-nuclear manganese bronze.
Yeah, that's got to be worth a lot to somebody.
Exactly.
So, with that being said, though, I don't want to cut you off, but if you had mentioned like up the street in Camden, if you had a park, you could put the four of them in a way that kind of showed how they were oriented on the ship itself.
I think that would be the most visually compelling way. You can't see them on the ship, but if we were able to orient them with roughly the same spacing as they show up on the ship, then you can go and see how big they are. And
you can like walk around and see and figure out, kind of like how the South Dakota Memorial has like the ship laid out with the barrels and everything.
That's exactly where I got the idea. We're on the same wavelength there. The problem is maybe it's more advantageous to us to separate those four out and put them in four different places around New Jersey to help advertise for the ship or something like that. But then again, they're disparate parts that are separated from the ship, and who knows 50 years from now when I'm not here and nobody remembers where this big urban art came from.
Urban art.
Yeah.
So I know that people are going to probably freak out about this, but knowing the fact that they probably would fetch a decent amount of money, if you pulled 3 or if you pulled 4 off, kept one here as a lawn ornament on your stern or your parking lot, and then you sold 3. I know that's like crazy and that hurts me to say, but I don't know, that's a pretty decent chunk of money that you could then use to do other things for something that a couple months or even at this moment is underwater and no one knows that they're there anyway.
If I had to guess, and I have not at all looked into this because it's not even an option for us, but if I had to guess, I'd say each one would fetch about 6 figures, low 6 figures in scrap value. So that would go a ways towards funding some other capital project. Absolutely, we could fund the entire restoration of the ship by scrapping the parts of the ship that we're never going to put on the tour route. We've got 1 engine room on the tour route. Let's scrap the other 3 entirely.
How would you even do that?
That's a great question.
We have to cut a big hole in the bottom or something, or out the side.
Well, we just cut everything up small enough in there that we can.
You can walk out the ladders individually.
Yeah, exactly.
So that brings me to another fun point about walking things through the ship, bucket-sized things. You were circling back around to your ballasting problem. Would you like to inform the audience?
First off, let me say that our contract with the Navy specifically prevents us from selling parts of the ship for any purpose. So we could not scrap the ship like we just mused about, even if we wanted to.
Okay, all right. Well, that's okay. Well,
but
so you couldn't sell off a propeller, or you mean machine parts like the engines?
It's kind of open-ended in the contract, and in theory, we could probably work with the Navy to come up with some exact, like, where is the line actually drawn. But the way I interpret it right now is nothing. It specifically says that we can sell pieces of teak and fasteners for the deck wood, provided that money goes back in the restoration of the ship. And we can remove parts of the ship, like it has wasted away entirely. It's just a rusty hole. We can cut that piece of metal out and replace it with a like piece of metal so that the ship is returned to original configuration. And at that point, we don't have to necessarily keep that rusty piece of metal.
So,
it has been replaced.
Okay, and I know I just brought up the ballasting thing, but
we're going to come to that.
We're gonna hit a. But you brought up something else now, which I think since you brought it up, let's just discuss this. How much of this dry docking is, okay, we're a museum and we know that we have XYZ problem and that we have to address and fix. And then how much of it is a Navy requirement? Because so a lot of people think, and you must see this too in your own comments, not only, on fan pages on Facebook and your own YouTube comment section, this idea, we're going to bring back the Iowa class. And I think you and I have talked about this too. Mm-hmm. It's like, that's not going to happen.
Probably not. Our contract says it can happen, but almost certainly not at this point.
So your contract says it can happen. So how much of this dry docking is because, we're a museum and this is what museums do, but how much of this dry docking is this is required by the Navy to maintain this ship based on this contract that you're talking about?
Good question. Good question.
Why? So then if you are under contract with the Navy, and maybe you don't know the answer to this, but if you are under contract with the Navy, then you do have to do X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. Then why is the federal government not held somewhat responsible for helping you do this?
That's a good point.
It's like, here's a battleship, maintain it, which Harry taxpayer has been doing for the last 50 years at tremendous cost. Mm-hmm. Now you become a museum, which good luck with that. But you fund a dry docking experience, which would cost So what's your take on?
We are receiving zero federal funding for this project.
Right.
We are also receiving no direct Navy oversight. Like, I had to reach out to them and tell them that we are going to move the ship because our contract requires us to inform the Secretary of the Navy if we're doing that.
Your battleship's floating down the river.
Exactly. It is not going to be where we told you it would be for a period of time, yes. and this is where it's going and why.
Every day you report, this day 80,000 or whatever, it's like battleship is still in Camden. Good job. Today it's floated down the river.
The contract says it will go to this address and it will stay here. Yes. And if we move it, so whether that is, hey, we've decided there's a better place to display the ship, or a new organization's taken over, or anything like that, or we're just going to go and do maintenance like this.
Change of address, just like anyone else.
Exactly. Okay. And we tell them, hey, we're moving for this period of time, for this length of time. So that is really the extent there. When we say that the Navy says we should do this, what I'm specifically referencing is the Navy has a manual for preservation of inactive ships. For them, that usually means maintaining the ships in the mothball fleet. But ourselves and many other museum warships use that as the guidelines for what needs to be done to preserve a ship like this that isn't active. Mm-hmm. And so the Navy says to dry dock an inactive ship every 20 years. So that's in the manual. That is not the Secretary of the Navy saying, hey, we might reactivate that. You've got to dry dock it and do X, Y, and Z. So it really is us using the Navy's own guidance and manuals, but not in any way their oversight or funding.
Okay. I'm just they make you jump through hoops, but we can't help you out with any sort of money. This is a massive project and a huge undertaking, and it's pulled off by just a handful of people here in this organization. And it's just amazing to me that you all can accomplish that mission with, obviously, like you said, the state has been tremendous in their support. But it still is amazing to me that a small group of individuals aboard this ship can do can organize this kind of work and pull it off. Whereas, if this was a commissioned vessel, you'd have hundreds and thousands of people involved. Of course, the whole crew itself would be involved, or in a way. So, it's just really remarkable that they're like, figure it out on your own.
Well, that's why our maritime history community is so important. That I can call up Travis on Texas and say, "Hey, I'm going to be the next battleship to dry dock after you. Can I come down and see what you're doing and see the questions you're asking your marine engineer and see the challenges you're facing, so that I know what to do?" Actually, I've got a trip down there in a week.
Really?
So next week I'm going down to hang out with Travis one more time before Texas is refloated, so that and some other senior staff here is going with me, so that we can see, like, all right, what did you accomplish? What are we going to need to look for? Ours is a much more truncated project, but we're going to run into the same exact challenges.
Yeah.
And we've talked to far more than just Texas. Mike Getcher on Iowa gave me some critical information that we didn't have the blueprints for, but he had some of the numbers for. Les over on Missouri, who was around when they dry docked her in 2009, was able to send us some critical documentation about how to ballast the ship. So we're working with the whole community here to figure out the best way. And then we're going to have members of our community from other museums come down and look at what we're doing, so that they can plan their own evolutions in the future.
Well, cool. So do you know the condition of Wisconsin? I mean, Iowa's being worked on right now as a part of that Surface Navy Museum. So, that I don't, so I think they're like, I hold them to some sort of separate standard. But then Wisconsin is, kind of traditional in the water. Obviously she's the newest, and the lowest mileage, so to speak. So, do you think will dry dock in the next 10, 15 years, maybe?
Keith is my counterpart there. Oversight on my part. He's also one of the people that we talked to when we couldn't find documentation and whatnot. And so they are looking at their own underwater maintenance. They have done a lot of work in situ, much like Iowa has. They've called out, I'm trying to remember the name of the company, but folks that do underwater hull work for the Navy, because they're right there in Norfolk, have come out and like polished the underside of the ship.
Sweepers, man your brooms.
Yeah, I'll be back in a few.
Mr. Roberts up in here. Sorry, that was too good to pass up. Okay, so sorry. So Wisconsin.
They are looking at doing that. Obviously, the dry dock that's closest to them is there in Norfolk. Obviously, that is a Navy dry dock, which limits their ability to get into it.
Well, right. I mean,
so they're trying to do a lot of work in situ.
That's like the Navy's only dry dock that can really do something like that on the East Coast. You're not going to park your battleship in it. Is God forbid you need it for a carrier.
No. Missouri's project was about 90 days long. Ours will probably be at least 60 days long. So you're losing this for a quarter of a year. That you could be building a new carrier in there or maintaining a Gator freight or any of these sorts.
That's incredible. So okay, well, but I think what you're saying though is Wisconsin is okay, at least for now.
They're both making plans for dry dock when they're able to, when that magic time frame hits, and for whatever reason, much like Missouri and Pearl Harbor, we don't have a ship going in there. You've got 90 days. Come on in. Do it now. When that happens, they'll be ready to go. But also, they're doing as much work as they can there in the berth, because they do have those local resources that are a little bit further away for ships like us.
Yeah. So what... Well, first off, what are your thoughts and opinions about World of Warships putting Wisconsin in the game?
Oh, I actually prefer that Wisconsin goes in the game before us. I like that we're going to be the last Iowa that's added to the game.
Oh, yeah?
Because of power creep.
See, okay, this is like, Wargaming might crucify me, but this is not official, okay?
Okay.
But based on conversations and what I know and how they operate, okay. Hi, Sergey. My guess is the version of New Jersey that you see in the game will be a 1980s, like, Tomahawk equipped game. or equipped New Jersey. Now, I only say this because
I thought the game ended around 1950.
You're absolutely right. But if you track the evolution, in the same way that Nick Moran said submarines will never be in World of Warships, and here we are. So my thought is that they've made a couple like game mechanic changes over the last couple of years with like homing torpedoes for the submarines, like the ping mechanic, like the Dutch cruiser line with like the airstrike, where you can, like, there's a grid square and you can just call an airstrike on that square essentially, and if a ship happens to be in the square, so you can miss. But so there's
think those mechanics are going to be translated into the missile
so how
age?
they work is like all these mechanics build on top of each other. And I don't think you'll see like an Arleigh Burke where I've got one 5-inch gun that doesn't really do anything and I have all these missiles.
Yeah, no, ships like Forrest Sherman with
yeah.
only 3 guns is really as close as you'll get, and that's overpowered rate of fire.
Right.
That they had to do to make that fair.
So my thought is that, yeah, so exactly. And the 2 torpedo tubes on each side that you can't aim.
Yeah, those aren't anti-ship
They're basically useless, without some sort of homing mechanic like they would have in real life potentially, or guided ability. So my thought is that New Jersey with the Tomahawks, well, New Jersey still has all of its guns. Granted, it's missing some secondaries.
Some of the 5-inch,
okay,
but yeah.
whatever. But
she's not going to be a close-in brawler if she's got long-range missiles.
The 9 16-inch guns are still there. So that still makes it an artillery-based ship at the end of the day. So in my mind, what I see from the evolution of the mechanics in the game is that eventually you will see a Tomahawk-equipped New Jersey. And of course, they will have to figure out how to balance that out with 1 or 2 other ships of other countries. I don't know what they'll be. Don't ask me. And again, this is speculation. I haven't been told anything, but I get like warm, fuzzy feelings when I have conversations with them. I get feelings certain times, and I've had this conversation, and like it trips my like radar, and usually I'm right like 99% of the time. So again, I haven't been told anything, but
I was just thinking we'd get something better than the other Iowas, like faster rate of fire
again,
or something.
I could be completely wrong. But the fact of the matter is that you have Iowa, which is represented in base form.
Right.
Then you have Missouri, which essentially is the same thing, but with the radar and everything.
So, yeah, a little bit better.
A little bit better. Stats are modified, but that's been power crept, as you said.
Yeah.
And then you have, now you have Wisconsin, which has all these newer sort of power creep gimmicks, so much so that they had to push it to tier 10. So now it's even.
Oh, so she's not tier 9 anymore?
No, right. So that's my point. Like, okay, so.
Suck it, Wisconsin at tier 10. We're going to be a tier 12 missile battleship.
But then they have the super ship line,
at
which
11,
is basically tier 11.
Yeah.
So I'm like, well,
missile ships at tier 12. New Jersey's the most powerful American battleship in the game. That's what I'm talking about.
So then, yeah, you end up with this like super New Jersey, this super Iowa that introduces like a Tomahawk missile thing, and the mechanic could be exactly the same as like pinging, like homing torpedoes or the Dutch airstrikes. It's you have to, you open it up on the map and you launch for this sector, and if something is there, and I don't know. Again, complete speculation. I just, having played that game from 2015 to today, I always see like how these mechanics evolve and how and they keep introducing things here and there. And I just like they said, no submarines, okay, well now we have submarines. Okay, no missiles, the game ends at 1950. That's bullshit. Like,
hey, Sergey, you know that probably 2 of our Tomahawks were nuclear tipped, right?
Yeah. You get 6 or 7 kills in a game, then you launch the nuke, just like in War Thunder.
Yeah.
The whole game ends for everybody.
Yeah. Oh, that is what I want. That is why I'm not worried that Wisconsin is getting in ahead of us.
So because a lot of people, I saw that in the comments, like, Wisconsin, no New Jersey? And I'm like, and in the back of my mind, I'm like, just wait. I'm like, something good for New Jersey's coming. Just wait.
We fire the first Tomahawk of really any active surface warship. They fired some test ones off of test ships. We fire the first Harpoon of any of the Iowas.
Yeah.
We have missiles, the longest of any of the Iowas. because we've got the longest 1980s, 90s commissioning period. It makes sense to make us that ship. I'm picking up what you're putting down. If you are right, it makes sense.
Well, so like for instance, destroyer, museum ship destroyer Småland, in the Swedish Navy, in the Pan-European destroyer. That's a premium tier 10 special, whatever. Well, it's got like 2 early like cruise missiles mounted over one of the torpedo tubes, like modeled in harbor, because that's the way it was in real life. And then when you actually go into a game, the missiles disappear and the rack is there. But and so my thought is like, there's other ships in the game already.
A Charlie Adams destroyer is just a Forrest Sherman with a gun removed and a missile in place.
Right. So there's already sort of models and things that exist in the game to where you could start to see that kind of stuff show up, and it wouldn't be like a complete stretch. And so anyway, that's what I think. In case anyone is wondering why we talk about World of Warships and you see some World of Warship stuff on this channel, I do the Naval Institute. I created and manage the Naval Institute partnership with World of Warships. So since 2019, if you see any United States Naval Institute content in World of Warships, including any of the missions, historical posts, historical articles, we have our own flag now.
Awesome.
As for the 150 year anniversary, I work with them to make that happen. So that's why you see World of Warships stuff on this channel, whether it's video or like, I think we talked about their cruiser book last time.
And I have the privilege of working with them through my other job at the Historic Naval Ships Association, where they sponsor a lot of our conferences.
Right. So again, this is not supposed to be a wargaming ad, but it's just it is fun though.
They support museum ships, and they are absolutely going to make New Jersey the most powerful battleship in the game.
So we'll see.
Which is why they're saving her for last.
Again, I can't if it's just speculation, but I know how they work, and that's what my gut tells me. So anyway. Okay. Long tangent aside. You're going to tell us about the ballasting problem and your fun, not so creative solution for that.
So the way the Navy would have, let me bring my baby up here. The way the Navy would have normally ballasted the ship was liquid loading. So there are a ton of fuel tanks, water tanks, things like that all around the ship. And if you start to be out of trim at the stern, you just flood more at the bow. So that was our original plan. It's about 500,000 gallons to get to the 2,000 tons we need to bring her closer to trim. We know that thanks to Missouri during her dry docking. The problem is if we leave the water in those tanks, which are all adjacent to the shell plating.
So the water is like, so you have the shell plating, which is the skin.
The outside skin, yeah.
The water is just, so you have the outside air. If this is New Jersey and dry dock.
Yeah.
You have the outside air, and on the inside of this plating, there's thousands of gallons of water.
500,000 gallons of water, yes.
And that water is sitting up against the plating.
Correct.
And which is cooling the plate, which is causing condensation on the metal on the outside.
Exactly. The hull will sweat.
Yeah.
And so you can't apply paint to that because it's wet. Or the paint, you can try it. It's just not going to bind properly.
Okay.
And since this is the first and last time we're going to paint the ship in 30 years and for the next 30 years, that's not ideal. So
not at all.
We had 2 options. One of them is to dewater the ship when we get into dry dock and then reballast before we leave. And we looked at that and we thought, hey, that's kind of weird. Do we have any other options? So we came up with 2 possible solutions.
Would dewatering the ship mean just when it sits down on the blocks and all the water is pumped out, just letting it out?
Yeah, essentially.
Okay. And then how do you get it back in? So when
run a hose to the river, essentially.
Okay. Gotcha.
I'm not sure what the specifics will be on that because we're still very much at the planning phase. We were put in touch with a contractor that has done similar work on USS Texas, so they've got battleship experience, and then they're helping plan this part of the process. But we do not have a fully finished thing yet. We've still got a couple of months. So 2 options that I came up with as alternatives to ballasting the ship, dewatering the ship, ballasting the ship, dewatering the ship. One, just a thought exercise. This isn't really doable, but A gun turret is 2,200 tons, or about 1,800 tons without the shells in it. So, notice turret 3's kind of far from the stern of the ship. If we pulled out all of turret 3, all 5 stories of turret 3 down into the hull of the ship, we have now removed 1,800 tons from the back of the ship. We set it on turret 1. We've added, this is why I love building block models of ships. We've now added 1,800 tons up forward. Now, that's not doing as much as if we had put the weight all the way forward or taking it off from all the way at the back. But taking this off is roughly equivalent to 1,000 tons, and putting it here around the middle from our center of buoyancy to our furthest extreme of the lever that is this ship. We're adding about 1,000 tons, so that will probably put us within trim. And
are you just, is this Orion's Zmansky fantasy, or in some crazy world could you hoist this turret and its mechanisms out of the barbette and actually set it down on the roof of turret 1? Like, is that physically impossible, or are you just having a laugh?
Well, a little A, little B.
Okay.
So Travis, who's at USS Texas, and I were talking about what the procedure would be to do this, and he ran me through how he would do it on Texas. Essentially, got to remove the breech from the guns. You can pull the gun barrels off. You can remove the armored roof. At that point, you can remove all the other turret armor. And then the 5-story structure itself, without the armor or the guns, is only about, 500 tons, something like that. So a big shipyard crane, in theory, an overhead gantry crane, could pull that structure out. Now, we haven't really talked about putting it back on the bow of the ship. This was more of a way to illustrate that even if we remove that 1,800 tons, we are still not in proper trim. We would still need 250,000 gallons of water at the bow of the ship. So it gives you an idea of the scale of the ballasting we have to do.
I think you've been down here too long.
Been breathing that diesel a little much.
Okay, so obviously that's ridiculous. So what was the other genius plan?
Well, and it sounded smart at the beginning until we actually did the math. I've got my notes here with some of the numbers. So, instead of 2,000 tons of water, 2,000 tons of gravel only costs about $64,000.
So you go down to the local Lowe's, pull out your VIP, contractor card, swipe it. I'll take $60,000 worth of gravel. All right. Where's your freight train that you need to transport?
And so we can have a crane that just lowers that, because all of these spaces up forward are former storage areas. So they're big open spaces that if we were to put containers of gravel in, it's no different than how the Navy put food, spare parts, like all that sort of stuff in there. And we looked at it. 2,000 tons of gravel is about 40,000 cubic feet of volume. And we've got enough room there.
Okay.
Now, see, where this becomes unworkable is we've got these trunks that takes the stuff all the way down. Of course, the lower on the ship we can put it, the better it's acting as a lever on.
Sure.
When you get to the bottom of that trunk, you still have to move the stuff out of the trunk and into the storage area.
Okay. So now you need everyone in New Jersey to come volunteer.
So if we break it down into sandbag size, about 66 pounds, which is possible for people to manually shift stuff for a while, that puts us at about 60,000 containers of gravel to move by hand. So there is no reasonable way of doing this that doesn't get completely absurd.
That's ridiculous. Well, with that said, I think I'm going to call it there. We've certainly talked and made a few. We've covered a lot of ground.
Covered a lot of ground for sure,
and made a few good points. Obviously, if you're all watching this because you're interested in the New Jersey dry docking, and so Ryan and Libby are going to produce a lot more content here in the future when we get closer to that.
We'll make a few videos about it.
Right, just a few. So we're certainly looking forward to that. Can't wait to see and experience that and everything else. So again, if you have any questions for us, put them down in the comment below. Make sure you like and maybe even subscribe to the channel if you like it. All right. And Ryan, you want to throw in your New Jersey pitch since Battleship New Jersey receives.
This channel does not receive operating support from the New Jersey Department of State.
No, it does not. Yeah. Anyway.
But our dry docking sure is.
But your dry docking sure is. All right. Thanks, everyone.